Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 164. Is music education for all realistic? With Stephen Cox. Stephen has the honor of being the first band director and educator of instrumental music to appear on this show. His perspective on music education brings some different insights to the big picture, so to speak. This created a very productive conversation about the pros and cons of our traditional models of music delivery in schools. Stephen came across my Facebook feed for a very viral, shared, something like 400 times post that he made about the dichotomy that sometimes gets presented for music educators between, say, Taylor Swift or Beethoven, which we use in the course of this conversation to be simply placeholders for modern popular genres of music, in the case of Taylor Swift, or Beethoven to be the proxy for classical music or more traditional genres. And Stephen and I have a great conversation about the nuance of those two poles as not necessarily being in opposition to each other. Stephen says there should never be a false dichotomy that pits Western European classical music traditions and literature against literally every other form of music making. And yet many organizations, schools, colleges, and musical institutions see other forms of music making as a threat, while defending the supremacy of Western European classical music. In this episode, we discuss the nuances of the large ensemble model that is common in the United States as the default for music education. Can it be simultaneously true that this model is crucial and valuable, but also we don't give enough institutional space for other systems and curricula? We also discuss the problems with conflating classical and Western with band, choir, and orchestra. In other words, is it still true that a choir can only sing music from these narrow genres? Of course it isn't. So tune in for this whole conversation. I think you're going to find it stimulating and informative. As you all know, I believe that music literacy is one of our primary functions as music educators in school. Music serves many purposes in many scenarios, but in school, our kids should come out literate. Sight Reading Factory is the best tool that I have come across in music education. It is so versatile, it is so customizable, and it is technologically ready to go at the click of a button in every single one of my class periods. So make sure you are signed up. Choralosophy discount code will get you 10% off when you sign up for Sight Reading Factory memberships for you and your students. And the best part is you can use that code again and again every year to continue to get that discount. I'm excited to tell you about Ludus.com, a new platform designed for the performing arts by people from the arts. With Ludus, you'll have access to a friendly, knowledgeable customer success team that's available when you need them. And the best part, there are no setup costs, contracts, or hidden fees. It's 100% free to your program, so why not give it a try and see how Ludus can help you streamline your operations and put the focus back on your passion for the arts. Choralosophy listeners can go to ludus.com/choralosophy for an upgrade for free to their marketing suite. The Choralosophy podcast continues to be free, and I'm working hard every week to provide this free content, but some of you, many of you, have decided, hey, I want to chip in financially to help make sure that the expenses of this show are covered, and just to say thank you to Chris for doing all of this stuff. If that's you, you can go to patreon.com/choralosophy and sign up for as little as $3 a month. There are, of course, various levels that you can join, and at the producer or above level, we have Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, Carlos, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Stephen Kathy Kikachik. Head to patreon.com/choralosophy and join the crowd. All right, everybody, I am here with Stephen Cox. Stephen came to my attention from a Facebook post recently that was really thought-provoking and really thorough. And so now what I'm interested here in is asking Stephen to come on and talk to me about what we mean when we say music education is for all, and music education is inclusive and open and expansive. And these are values that as music educators and artists really in general, I think we all share. What ends up being the interesting part of this conversation is that the devil is oftentimes in the details of what that means in the different contexts in which we teach and in which we do our art. So this is going to be an exciting conversation. So Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So who are you? Tell everybody a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I grew up in a little rural Texas town, in the middle of nowhere. Was in the band program. You know, my family makes music. My dad's an amateur bluegrass musician, which tortured me as a child, but I appreciate now. And you know, my grandfather used to mail me like big band music and things. So I had these influences. I fell in love with music, fell in love with playing the clarinet in particular. And I went to college, became a music teacher, and this is my 14th year teaching. I taught 10 years at a little rural town called Eastland, only an hour away from where I grew up. And so most of my experience has been teaching band, and there's a lot of choral people that listen to this, but I hope that you guys will be happy to welcome me into the choral pool to visit with you guys. And, you know, I really believe in rural education, and I think it's really important because that's where I grew up, but now I teach in an inner city school district.
Hmm.
And so I've taught years of band, but now I teach band. I teach modern band, which is a pop music curriculum. I get to work hand in hand with a mariachi program that's in our school, but I don't have responsibility for that. I just get to hang out with them a little bit.
Okay.
And so that's kind of what I do. That's who I am. In 2022, I was the Grammy Music Educator of the Year. And so if anyone's familiar with that program, you know, that was a really neat experience for me, but we're not really here to talk about that. But if you've ran into me before, it might have been from that.
Okay, that's very neat. Yeah, I'm interested. I'm sure that some of those other types of programs that you teach at your school will come up as part of this conversation because that's really the post that drew me to you. And by the way, actually, before I get there, I'll say since you mentioned that this is mostly a choral educator show, you're right. Although we do a lot of work here on expanding the conversation to music education in general, and then oftentimes we'll even get to education as like just the system of public education in the U.S. in comparison to other ways of educating around the world and all those types of things. So we like to be broad based. So we're excited we have a band director on the show. This is good, and a band person. So let me start this way. Here's the post. This is the post that I found of Stephen. Actually, shout out to Chris Hansen. Chris is a listener and had shared this post, and that's how I saw it. So I'm just going to read it, and then I want you to tell the story. What inspired you to post this? Whose music is better, Beethoven or Taylor Swift? Whose music should we be teaching in schools? There are two types of music educators: those who will answer this question with a preference, and that will challenge the validity of the question. The only acceptable answer is that music is music. It should be acceptable for all forms of music to be taught in schools. There should never be a false dichotomy that pits Western European classical music traditions and literature against literally every other form of music making. And yet, many organizations, schools, colleges, and musical institutions see other forms of music making as a threat while defending the supremacy of Western European classical music. When jazz programs entered schools, some people fought back, arguing that it would ruin music education. The same with mariachi programs, and now the same with popular music programs. When will we learn? I love band, orchestra, and choir programs, and I want children to have access to these kind of large ensemble music making programs. However, other forms of music education are not the enemy. They are valid, and they reach kids that we aren't reaching. I want to live in a society where most people consider themselves to be music makers. In that society, all forms of music thrive. We don't get there by creating hierarchies. We get there by embracing all forms of music making, all cultures, and all musical traditions. We move forward out of love and inclusion, and not out of fear. And it was attached to a graphic that said music education for all means all students and all forms of music. So very well written, very well thought out. We're going to dig into it here in a minute, but first, why don't you tell us what inspired that post and kind of what was running around in your brain the day you wrote that?
Yeah. So one of the things that has been a big experience for me this last year is that I did start teaching popular music inside of my classroom. I teach in San Antonio ISD. And I went to a school that is just very weird. It's an in-district charter school, and there's like three different schools on the same campus. And for the last 10 years or so, the band program had just kind of been a mess. It hadn't worked. It didn't have any of the normal things that fall into a Texas band program in particular. And everyone was trying to make it fit that mold, but it didn't fit. And so for me, I was looking at wanting to spend more time with my family. I was doing more speaking and all region bands and things. And so I needed to take a break from the marching band schedule. And so I came here into this program, and I thought I was going to launch into something that looked more like a New Orleans style street band. I thought, that sounded like the flexibility we could use with that instrumentation. I didn't really know. I knew that I wanted to try a slightly different model in this place. So I walked into the first open house and I brought an electric guitar with me, just kind of on a whim. And there was so much response that, I thought maybe this was a model that could work there, and bringing kids. See, at this campus, a lot of kids come in ninth grade, having never played a musical instrument, having never sang in a choir, having never done anything like that. And for me, as the band director, it's very hard for a kid to come in ninth grade and learn trumpet and feel very quickly like they're making music. It is possible. I've had students do that, but the success rate is weird. Pretty quickly they realize they're 3 years behind everybody else, or 4 years behind. It's very hard to overcome that. But I thought this medium is very flexible for people who've never played before, right? So I was in a place where I had the license to experiment, so I did. And my experiences over the course of this last year were amazing. Like, it was remarkable, the depth of what my students were learning and doing, and how much of it was actually student-led, and the kinds of students that were coming into that program that just had not studied music education in any other way. And so, since that's happened, I've become a real big believer in reaching students through music that they already love, and making the music education pie bigger. So, whenever we launched this program at my school, immediately the band program within a week went from 60 students to 165 students. Okay. Mm-hmm. None of the other music programs saw any decline in enrollment whatsoever. We're a year later, now there's 260 students that are studying this program. Of those, a lot of them are those pop music, over 200 probably are pop music students. The concert band has gotten better. It's going to be on a slow growth path, but immediately there's now over 200 kids that weren't studying music a year ago that are doing it now. And so that's been this really big thing. But there are some people that are very upset with the idea that we would allow students to study popular music in schools. There's people that are upset that we teach jazz and mariachi as well. These are conversations I've had with people, and a lot of times it comes from a lot of different places. But that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about what a huge benefit this program had been to my students that I was working with, and how it had just improved the music programs across our whole campus. But also that in most places where these things aren't happening, which is most places, there's a lot of skepticism and a lot of fear that this is going to mess up the thing that we've all been working really hard for, right? So, there's places where people have fought to grow an amazing choral program or amazing band program, and they're worried if something like this were here, that it would be a threat. If the kids could study popular music, that would hurt in some way. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, that's a lot of background on that. I don't know if any of that was very clear, but that's essentially what was going through my head.
No, it was. That's very helpful. I'm a big believer in context, and of course, all those things are hard to include. Your post was already, long. It would
Yes.
it would have been even longer had you started from that beginning of that story. But podcasts are great for
exactly
that.
Right. Yeah,
we can dig into it. So, when you say you've got these students, and that's an awesome story. You've got these students that are studying popular music in school. Could you tell us a little bit more, what is a day in a life?
Yeah.
Of that kid coming to your class studying popular music? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we're using the modern band format. This has been around for a while now. The organization that has built the most support and resources behind it is an organization called Music.Will. They used to be Little Kids Rock, but they're like, a lot of our kids aren't playing rock music, and a lot of them aren't so little, so they changed to Music.Will. And so I use their method book for starting kids out, but it actually goes in a lot of different directions. So every single class period that I have that's a modern band class period, 3 things are happening simultaneously. Number one, everyone who's coming there for the first time is taking beginner instruction on either guitar, bass, keyboards, or drum set, which are the 4 instruments that you find most widely used in popular music, not just now, but for like the last 70 years. Right. When my kids play classic rock, they're playing their grandparents' music. They're not playing their parents' music or their music. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but they take beginner instruction. We focus on learning how to comp, so understanding chord progressions, being able to play chord progressions to accompany a singer or to play inside of a band. We do songwriting, we do improvisation. Music notation reading is kind of a side by side kind of thing. So, like a student that finishes that first method book will understand some of the basics of reading notation, but they'll be able to play thousands of songs.
Hmm.
So they learn a lot of skills that you don't normally learn inside of a large ensemble music making experience, but they're different skills, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Now, how does a class look in more broadly in the sense you said they've got these four instruments they're learning? How many kids
Mhm.
might you have in a class period learning all these instruments? So like how many on piano, how many on drums, or do you limit it at all? Do
Yeah.
they get to choose? Like how does that work?
They get to choose, and a lot of kids will wind up learning to play multiple instruments. Like that's really common for students to learn how to comp on guitar and then also learn how to write bass lines and things like that. So there's a
Uh-huh.
lot of crossover. They may switch from week to week or month to month because a lot of the skills carry over anyway. I my classes, I have as many as 50 students in a class period, which is a lot. A lot of people are doing this with 10 or 15 or 25 students, but we've got a lot of demand right now, and I don't say no. I'm like, send them, we'll figure out how to make it work. And so, in general, we're one to one on instruments. I've collected a lot of instruments over the last year, and there's been some resources to do that. But the resources for this entire popular music program with over 200 students is less than the cost of like one and a half tubas, right? So when I think in terms of band cost, like it's a lot lower because you can buy a nice guitar, for a couple $100. You can buy a decent keyboard for a couple $100. You can buy an electronic drum set for $400, right?
Mhm.
You can buy a good trombone that'll last in a program for $4,000. So it's a different type of cost, but we have a lot of instruments, and so I'll have 5 or 6 kids playing drum set, one on acoustic, one on electric. They'll rotate in and out. We'll have 8 to 10 bass players and guitar players and keyboard players in general. And so far, it's worked out that the distribution is even enough that it works from class to class.
Yeah. Yeah, now that the first thing that jumps into my mind hearing you explain this is that, when I've had a similar conversation like this over the years with different folks, in your introduction, you kind of mentioned that some people, some music teachers can hear the message you're sending and hear that as a threat to the work that they've done to build these programs because there and I think there is some validity to that concern in that a lot of that work that people have to do to build these programs means convincing administrators to support the programs, and that sometimes other teachers can see something that is more and um, modern and popular, so to speak, is sexier, and they're afraid that that will take the attention away from administrators, decision makers who are writing checks, to push that type of thing on their program. Now, I don't really. That's not really my concern. I'm not really concerned about that. I'm concerned only about whether or not we're able to access large numbers of kids with good quality music education, right? And it sounds like in your situation, that's exactly what you're doing. The way you're describing all of this, for what it's worth, I would be super supportive of, because my I don't know, ethos, I guess, when I'm thinking, if someone were to ask me, what do you think a public school music program should be like? I would answer, I don't care what somebody else's public school music education looks like, as long as it's accessing large numbers of kids with high quality music instruction. Now, that could look a whole bunch of different ways in a whole bunch of different places, and so I think that's good. But another thing that jumps out at me though is the difference between some of these things with vocal music and choral music programs. There are some like apples and oranges things, because if for me to start a choir, it's free essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't have to buy anything, and so in a lot of places, a choral program is a even it can be a really quick way to get access to a large number of kids and develop that high quality music instruction without having to make any financial investment at all outside of, a little bit of sheet music and maybe a piano or a keyboard for the room. So there are some differences there which we'll get into, but I think you're doing amazing things, and that sounds like a completely valid approach, especially because you were responding to the kids in front of you, and
Right.
adjusting your back, like the things in your background, to help you present something to them in the unique situation that you're in. So bravo.
Well, it's been interesting. The thing, I think all the models that we have that are out there that you can look at for music education, they all come with different benefits and drawbacks,
Yep.
and more importantly, different audiences. And so, we have, like I said, at my school, the primary ways to study music are through mariachi, which in San Antonio is incredibly culturally relevant. It's
Mm.
its own set of literature, and in many ways, it's much closer to what we're doing in the modern band pop music program as far as the techniques that they use than it is to like a concert band.
Hmm.
A lot of their students are comping, but they're comping in mariachi style. Things like that. So there's a lot of crossover in the exact techniques that are being used, but a big difference in what the literature is. Same thing, with my concert band. I have a catch-all concert band. I'll let anybody into it. We all have to be able to read notation, but weak players, strong players, I'll take anybody into it, right? And you show up with violin and you want to play in a large ensemble, you can come play in my band. We'll rewrite the parts, whatever it's going to take. Okay. Because I want there to be a large ensemble traditional music making experience available at my campus.
Yeah.
And I want to build that and support that because there are kids that really want to go and sit and play clarinet and they have no interest in playing rock and roll guitar. And
Mm.
there's kids that really want to be in a choir, but they don't want to front a pop music band. Uh,
Right.
you know, there's all these different types of students that want a different experience out of music. And choral programs, band programs, all of these things are better whenever the kids that are there are wanting to do that and not this is just all they got left with, you know.
Hmm.
Which I don't know. I've been teaching long enough, and I taught in that little bitty town where we were the only music program in the high school. Like we were it. There was no choir program, orchestra, mariachi was nothing. It's a band. That was it. You could do band, art, and theater, where the fine arts, right? It
Hmm.
was a small town with about 4,000 people in the town. And at those points, anytime we talked about the possibility of something being new, I was scared of that. But I wish I hadn't been because we just would have had more kids studying music. That's what it would have amounted to in the end.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's great, and I think just for some context, my audience mostly knows this, but you may not. In my school, we are band, orchestra, choir. It's all large ensembles. We have one music appreciation class, we have one adaptive music class, and then we have a what we call International Baccalaureate Music curriculum, which is kind of a survey of music history and portfolio class with composition units and different types of things in it. It's an advanced class, and that's it. That's all we offer. But we also have all of those programs are very large, robust, and popular, and with multiple levels of band, choir, and orchestra that kids can progress through, and it's very performance focused, very what a lot of people would look at and call traditional. And so that's where and I think again I support what we do and I advocate for what we do, but that's not the same thing as saying that what you're doing is invalid. Does that
Right.
make
Well,
sense?
and I support what you're doing too. Like
Mhm.
again, I love conducting a concert band. I
Yeah.
love doing all region bands, like I really believe in these large ensemble mediums. But I would be willing to bet that if tomorrow a modern band program popped up on your campus, that there would be almost no effect on your traditional programs, but there would be more kids studying music that aren't doing it yet. That would be my guess, and that's what most of the data and the people I've talked to. I've yet to actually find an example where there were these strong, wonderful traditional music programs, and they introduced something like modern band, and it just ruined everything. Even though that fear is there, I haven't even heard stories, and there may be, and maybe I get a call after this, but everything I've read doesn't seem to support that. On average, there's any chance of that happening.
Now, see, I agree. I agree. I think that would be a net benefit to our school and to our music program overall, with one giant if, and that is if an administrator or the decision makers in my district were to be convinced that that needed to be added without taking other things away. because
Mhm.
because oftentimes that is the reality, is that the programs like you're describing get created in a vacuum where there aren't already large robust programs happening, and then they grow from there, just like you described at your school, that has been growing and becoming successful. But what would happen, for example, I know that I teach, X number of hours a day, and I have, out of the total 7 that our teachers teach to be full time, and my schedule's full. My assistant choral director, her schedule's full. The orchestra teacher's schedule is full, with classes that are already full to the brim of kids. And the reality in the way school districts oftentimes work is, if, let's say, all of us were to get together and go and say, hey, we want to do this modern band program, they would say, okay, which class will you take a teacher from? To put in this other class, and we'd have to figure out a way to staff it within the staff that we already have. Our chance of success of getting them to say, okay, and we are again add an FTE and hire a new teacher to add to the music department to add all these things, is very low. I would love it if I had that kind of power, but I think in a lot of places, I think I think that's probably where the objection would come from, is saying like, well, in our environment, I would be concerned that we would have to give up the parts of the program we already have to add this other thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and it would have to come from your district not saying, here's an alternative to something that we're doing, but saying, hey, there's all these kids that don't have a place in the arts at our school. There's this percentage of kids, which depending on the campus might be 80% of the kids, may not be inside of any type of fine art or music in particular. It would be from them saying, it would be worth adding a program like this and staffing it in order to reach those students. Most schools, they base their staffing off of enrollment anyway. So if an extra 300 kids are suddenly taking music somewhere, a lot of times the district can justify hiring a staff member to do that. I'm not saying that everybody should be advocating to do this at their school. I think that the people that believe in it and want to do it and want to make it happen, that it shouldn't be seen as inappropriate or inferior to the other music education offerings that we have. And
Yes,
that's the bigger thing I'm concerned about.
and on that point, you and I are totally in agreement. That, like I said before, that's where the alignment happens, when we have these types of conversations. Because I think in the same way, though, I actually hear people making points similar to yours, but but in the other direction, with that invalidation aspect added into it. So I don't hear you as invalidating anybody, just for the record, but I do hear that sometimes, where the reason we should add these modern programs is because the traditional programs are, rooted in colonialism, or all those types of arguments that you have, and that you hear out there. Whereas, I reject that type of thinking, because everything has a history, and what's the reality is, my traditional program that is a choral program has 100 kids in the advanced level class, because they keep coming back year after year, and their lives are changed for the better because of the class. And I don't care if some duke or duchess somewhere did something bad 300 years ago, and when choir was being invented, like, that means nothing to the kids that are in my classroom right now. Those types of types of things come into this conversation too. In fact, that was one part of your post that I wanted to zoom in on, because I agree with the way you phrased it, and that's kind of related, which is the line you wrote where it said, there should never be a false dichotomy that pits Western European classical traditions and literature against literally every other form of music making. I totally agree. I think instead what we do is we teach that, you said this also, but we teach that music is music. But what I would mean by that, and I want to see what you think, is if I were to say music is music, what I mean is that all music has grown out of some other music in some very, very difficult to pin down way. It's all connected. All musical traditions have borrowed from every other musical tradition, and it's been this growth almost like evolution in biology. It's like where did the arm come from? Like, I don't know. Like it evolved over time in like this very, very complicated web, and getting students to see that is what I mean. What I would mean if I teach music is music. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think we can certainly agree that, you know, music being organized sound in some way by humans, that, all of that is going to be related. Whenever you hear frequencies that are doubled, it's going to sound like an octave, right?
Uh-huh.
Like there's a lot to sound and organization. And to be honest, everything that we've been talking about today, be that mariachi pop music or whatever else, is descended from Western harmony. And we haven't even talked about other types of tuning systems or organizations or things. And those are things that I'm not teaching in my classroom right now that are valid.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think in places, if you wanted to have a music education program that's built off entire other traditions of music making, that's really appropriate too, especially if it makes sense culturally for the students you have. I think music education should be able to look different based on who's in the classroom, both the students and the teacher, based on where the classroom is located.
Yes.
This is actually the thing that I do worry about. Like I said, I really care about all of our traditional music making mediums. I care about band, I care about orchestra, and I care about choir. And those are usually the big three, whatever we're talking about music education, right? So I don't want to leave out things like I feel like elementary music teachers get no love and they're like doing a harder job than all the rest of us. But, you know, I worry about these programs in some ways just because, over my lifetime, I feel like I've seen a decline in lifelong participation in a lot of these activities.
Mm.
Um, so uh, every church had a choir when I was growing up, I thought,
Mm-hmm.
like it seemed like there was quite a lot of church music making, and it seemed like it went away almost all at once. Community bands used to be a lot more common than they are now. I never read an article about a city starting up a new orchestra, and I hear about them shutting down all the time. The summer before I moved to San Antonio, their orchestra shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And these are major causes, I think, for all of us to have concern about music education as a whole, and whether or not what our goals are and the way that we're conducting these classes is helping make sure that all of this continues to exist in society, or if we're part of the problem. And I'd say this about everything that we do, because the things that give me the most concern, well, let me completely back up. What are your lifelong goals for your students? Like, what do you want them to have gained by being inside of your choir?
So that's a great question. So for my students, what I would hope that they pull out of their time in choir with me is that they have become aware of their own ability to access musical information on their own without my help. That's a big part of the way I deliver choral music education is I want them to be literate musicians who have become curious enough about music to where if they were to choose to, they could go out of my class with the tools that they've learned and teach themselves a song. Sit under a tree with a piece of music and read it like they read, Moby Dick or whatever. They would be able to do that. Now, of course, that's hard and that takes a lot of hard work. That's one category. The other category is that we would have explored enough repertoire from enough different times and places and cultures and societies that they would be because I can't expose them to all of that, like everything that's ever been written. That's impossible. But
Of course.
I could expose them to enough diversity of those things that they would become curious about what else might also be out there. And then I guess finally, another category is that they would be lifelong appreciators of music, whether they choose to actually sing in a choir physically every week for the rest of their life. That would be great if they did, but it's either that or they're a civic supporter. They're someone who helps cultivate the love of music in their own kids someday. Whatever it is. But I would say those are the three things that I would hope that my students would achieve.
Yeah. Well, and I've asked this question of a lot of people, and those are the ones that usually come up, right? I like your first one because that's all about self-sufficiency. Is you want those students when they leave the room for their music making not to be hampered by the fact that you're not in front of them. I think that's really, really valuable. I agree with that. The point about being lifelong appreciators of music, this one has always confounded me just a little bit, because I think there's like the adjacent goal to that is lifelong musicians, right? That's the adjacent goal to lifelong music appreciators. And a lot of times when I ask people what they mean by music appreciators, is that like they buy symphony tickets or donate to the local band boosters or things like that. And for me, I think the more ambitious of those two goals is lifelong music makers, because those people are also going to be music supporters, I would assume. Like it's very hard to be an active musician and be like, music sucks, right?
Right.
And so I've been really focused on that last one. How do we make music lifelong music makers, and what do our classrooms have to look like? I think the big part is what you first said when you said the students need to be able to be self-sufficient whenever they leave the room. It's really important inside of our large ensembles that we teach them how to make music within that large ensemble, and also how to make music when they're not with the 60 of their closest friends.
Right.
Yes. This is a thing I've seen experimented about a lot. They also, something that, crosses over. Because when we talk about teaching music inside, I'm getting back to the topic of this podcast, whenever we take and we're, talk about popular music in classrooms and things. I sometimes talk to people and they want to instill in children a love of music. Like they'll say that. And that's the one goal that I will always challenge, because they already love music. Like you walk into a hallway and you look at all the kids, they all have headphones on. Half of them are in like Nirvana t-shirts or something, and they're not listening to podcasts, right? That's not NPR in their headphones. It's music. And it is varied. The first thing I do on my first day with all my popular music students is I have them get out their phone, and I stole this from somebody at a session, but I love it, and just pick a song on their phone that they love. And then it needs to be something that has some type of resonance for them. And they hit play on their phone, and they talk about the song while the song plays. And you hear all this. And normally it's, this is the first song that I ever listened to with my dad, and we would listen to it in the car. Or this is this, and they'll tell you all about music. And the type of music is almost irrelevant. It is how that music connected them to other people. And so whenever I think about lifelong musicianship, I want to capture as much of that as possible. And I want students to see themselves as being able to make music. A lot of the kids that come into my pop music classes, they, some of them, they did band for a semester, but maybe they were last chair and they didn't feel like they were very good. And something about that experience told them they were not a music maker. They weren't good at it. But we know that everyone's a music maker, that you can't have a sentence without a rhythm, that like you can't walk through a room without a beat. Like we're all music makers, but a lot of people don't see themselves as that. And I worry that there are practices that we've built into all of music education that are actually doing it. And I'd say the two biggest things are, number one, we have an over obsession with quality inside of music education. And so I want to give you all the caveats, because I think this is a place where people may or may not disagree. I really believe in having quality programs. We talked about that. And every program can be quality, but not every program can be competitive by definition of what competitive means, right? Like literally, if we are focused on competitive quality, we have to label most people as losers in order to do that, right? Right. In my state, we are obsessed with that, but I think we're culturally obsessed with that. There are places where you can teach that it's almost like a video game on a different mode. I don't know how many of your listeners play video games, but you got like story mode where it all kind of just goes and there's not a lot of difficulty. Then you got easy mode where like the fights are challenging, but you get as many respawns as you want, and you work your way up. So you got like super hardcore mode. So there's a lot of places where kids are learning and people are teaching that are set on hard mode. Those programs are almost always going to not be as competitive as programs that have all the resources and are set on easy mode. They can be very, very good, but our high schools right now for our band programs, the system's gotten so weird that on average a 5A band in our district is getting about 8 or 10 students into their high school band program. We're in a crisis,
Wow. Yeah.
those programs are not going to compete like the nearby suburban districts that have this wonderful feeder system where everything's lined up and all the counselors have the packet and everything's going. No matter how hard those kids work, those kids can still produce quality, but it's literally not going to be the same. And getting them to that, even a close level, which I think is worth doing, it requires a great deal of sacrifice from the educators involved and from the students beyond sometimes what's reasonable, right? What I worry is because we're so obsessed with this, we take a certain percentage of the kids and we almost push them out of our programs. And I'm just talking about music education at large. There's lots of exceptions. Lots of people are really focused on making sure the worst player or singer and the best singer feel equally like they're valued. But there are certain things, and especially that from school to school, or especially within school competition among students, over going from it being really good to being the best, like that area knocks a lot of people out of music education. And I worry about that.
Yeah.
Like it's missing the overall point in order to chase something that is very good for our careers, but may not necessarily be delivering the same amount of good to our students.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, and because I agree with all that, I think to me, the distinction, I might find the distinction in different places. So to me, those types of problems in music education come more from how the course is delivered than what type of course is delivered.
I'd agree with that, because you can do all those things in any type of music education
Yes.
environment.
Right, exactly. And so I think, so for example, to kind of take this back specifically to your post, you framed it in kind of a dichotomy between popular and classical music. So, for
Yeah,
example,
well, or arguing that I argue that dichotomy, which is often posed, is an irrelevant dichotomy, a false dichotomy. But you're
yes, yeah. Now, I do very, very little pop music in my choir program. Now, and maybe this is a point of agreement. I'm not sure. It could just be a semantic difference. I also do like never do Beethoven, because Beethoven's not really appropriate vocal, and the vocal lines that Beethoven wrote are not appropriate for high school age singers. I mean, they're barely appropriate for adult singers. I mean, he was atrocious part writer for singers. He just didn't really know the voice very well. I mean, if you're a tenor or a soprano, God bless you, hanging out on high B flats for 14 measures in a row, or whatever. And so in that sense, I kind of get a little bit bristly when folks talk about equating a traditional choir program or a traditional band or orchestra program with Western classical music tradition, European Western classical music tradition, because in reality, these days in 2023, you can run a choral program that is doing music from everywhere, from all across time, written by all kinds of people. And I think that's true in band and orchestra as well, becoming more so over time. So, for example, if I have a choir that looks like a traditional choir in that it stands on risers and they've got their choir robes or they're wearing dresses or whatever it is, but I'm singing music from, you know, I don't know, a black gospel composer from who lives down the road. That he just wrote it last week. Do I have a Western classical European traditional choral program? Like, well, not on that song. I don't. And so I think ultimately it's the categories themselves that I think we are spending too much time focusing on. But maybe that is kind of the point you were making in that they're not really relevant distinctions in the first place. Thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. So a lot of the mentality that I take into my pop music program is that, wherever possible, I'm going to be as student centered as possible, right? Like I want it to be about my kids. I want their interest to lead a whole lot of what we're doing, right? I want to find things that we can perform together that are relevant, and I want them to bring me things that they want to perform that are relevant, right? Like I really want them in on all of those different decision-making processes.
Mm-hmm.
And from all that being said, none of that has to do with genre or composer or anything necessarily, right? I want it to be something that they're going to derive as much value as possible. And we think about our audience too. What's going to, make the parents and everybody excited? What's going to bring that authentic music making experience of not just, I guess what I'm saying is, I'm drifting away from what we're talking about, but I think it's important. It's all of those human connections, right?
Mhm.
So, what you're talking about, if you find a gospel singer that's written this amazing work and they're just down the street and that person can walk in your room and meet your kids, oh my gosh, that is a life altering experience for a lot of young people,
Yep.
right? For
Yep.
them to just see that the word composer doesn't mean necessarily Beethoven, that it can mean this black gospel singer down the street, right? Like
Right.
that's a big deal. And we have access to more of that than ever before, which is really good. And people care about that a lot more than they used to. But there are still people that are going to fight and argue that it has to be a very certain way, and there's certain lanes you really need to get into, or it's not really appropriate for schools. I don't think you and I are arguing that right now. I think we probably agree that there's a lot of flexibility here for meeting kids' needs, and delivering great music programs.
Right.
But there are people that will disagree on that. And again, a lot of times there's this weird thing. My post is about reaching all the kids. Like, I would love, again, I said this, I want to see a society where most people consider themselves to be music makers. And the same way that most people consider themselves to be readers or writers now, and our literacy rate is like 97% or something. That wasn't always true. Literacy rates used to be like 40 or 50%, right? And then we decided, no, this is something everybody should be able to do. We don't, again, I'm drifting just a little bit. I'm sorry for that. But I think it's just really, really important that we see all of this different literature, be it, kids learning to play the pop music they're listening to right now, or bringing in that gospel singer down the street, or performing Beethoven because for some reason you think those vocal parts are right for your kids this year, that all of those things are valid and they
Yeah.
all speak to different kids in different ways.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think where one possible pushback to that idea could come from teachers talking about what is appropriate in schools, and again, I think it's might also again be semantics. That's always the caveat, because a lot of these conversations ultimately come down to what I mean by a thing is different than what you mean by a thing.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
but so Taylor Swift does not need help reaching teenagers. And she does not need the help of the school music teacher. The kids come already knowing Taylor Swift, and they have all the songs memorized. And they come to our class. I would also argue that Taylor Swift needs zero help from me in validating Taylor Swift in the minds of a student. In fact, it's the other way around. I have to work to validate choral music in their minds. That's choral music would die without the school. Taylor Swift would not. And so there is a distinction between what music programs are teaching as and I worry that sometimes the argument then becomes, well, if let the market decide what music should survive. Well, if that were the case, Beethoven would be dead. Renaissance polyphony would be dead. All of those types of everything in an art museum would be irrelevant. And so there is a distinction between what do we need our institutions to keep alive as part of our cultural heritage and as part of the academic approach to music that is different than the role that pop music plays in our minds. Thoughts?
Yeah. Well, let me hop all around that because that's great. I like that seed question. Let me start with Taylor Swift. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
most of the kids know who Taylor Swift is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the kids, without the help of somebody, don't believe they could sing like Taylor Swift. Well, I think that's very attainable for most people. They don't believe that they could write songs like Taylor Swift. Well, actually, that's very attainable for most people to be able to write songs of that quality, which I think is good quality songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they may know who Taylor Swift is, but they may not believe that they are capable of being their own Taylor Swift.
That's a great
Okay.
point. Yep.
And so I think we play a huge role if we really desire, because the problem that we have that I worry about the most is that, again, choral music, I think, is worth doing. And I think kids are going to be attracted to it for a lot of different reasons. Same
Yep.
reason they like bands, same reason they like mariachi, right? I think those mediums are really, really valuable. I think that it's powerful whenever a teacher connects the music outside of that classroom into that classroom too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that choirs that take and perform a Taylor Swift song, and they reap some benefits from that. And they don't have to do that without also performing all their traditional things. I spoke to a choir director, and I love what she does. Her name is Rebecca Sensor. She's in Pennsylvania. I met her this summer at a convention, actually at the Modern Band Summit. And she teaches in a rural school, and she has all of her traditional choir programs. A lot of the year, her program looks a lot like a traditional choir program. The last 9 weeks, the last quarter of the year, the students design their own program. They pick the songs, they help write the arrangements, and they perform what amounts to a lot of popular music that the kids picked.
That's
And her
almost
choir
exactly
has
what we do.
well,
That's
yeah, well,
almost exactly what we do. Yeah.
yeah, well, and that's wonderful. Like that time spent playing popular music, with the kids, help. And again, she has them help write the arrangements. So, like, how would we do this? Where should we put a solo? How can we do harmony? What should we use an intro? Hey, you play guitar. You come play guitar for us when we're doing this. She brings them into this authentic, flexible music making experience within her large ensemble program. And
Yeah.
where I think she's able to incorporate a lot of the benefits of my popular music program that I think are, because again, there's different benefits. I really do believe that. And that's part of the reason they attract different people. But she's able to implement that into her choral program in a really neat way and bring together the music programs from across the school. Oh, I love that. You can't take that to a contest anywhere. No one's going to adjudicate that, but you change lives and you change communities. And I think if all of our programs, like all the music ed programs, thought like that, like everywhere we're teaching, we made sure that we made time to bring in whatever music the kids love as much as possible. I'm not saying all the music all the time, but to create these collaborative projects with the kids that connects everything you're doing with the traditional choral music and with the traditional arrangements with what they're listening to. I think there would be more choir programs in communities. I think there would be more community bands. Like I think there's a net positive by connecting to all of these things. So the thing you said that was interesting was that choral music and concert bands and orchestras would die without the schools. Is that more or less what you said?
Yeah.
That should have us all really concerned about these programs. Like we need to make them relevant within our communities. Like, the community I left has 4,000 people in it. There were lots of kids that had been in band and weren't playing anymore. One of my former students is working at community college. They launched a community band, and all of a sudden, like 60 people in the community were playing again, just because there was an opportunity to do it. You
Mm-hmm.
know, if that this type of flexibility, I think, is really important, and a lot of times it gets pitted against, whatever we're doing for competition or adjudication. In the band world, it gets pitted against a really busy football schedule and all these things. And so I guess what I'm saying is I'm advocating for all of that, but I'm also advocating for not treating, what Taylor Swift, like it doesn't have huge benefits for us,
Yeah.
and Taylor Swift is a marker. There's so much really good popular music, you
Yes.
know,
She is a, we're using her as a proxy for
for just
all
any,
types of,
yeah,
yes. In the same way we're using Beethoven as a proxy for all types of classical or more, I guess, genres of music that are antiquated and, not as commercially viable or,
right.
whatever. So, and that's actually, that's all very good. I also have, this thought that keeps creeping up in my mind related to this topic too, where, and this, I think I saw this in some comments. There's so many. This
Yeah.
post you made was shared a whole bunch of times and got a lot of really great conversation going. If we had like 12 hours to record this podcast, we could read through some of them.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I kind of reject as a premise is that
Yeah.
if I don't teach Taylor Swift in my class, that I am saying that Taylor Swift is less than, and that sometimes gets that claim gets made, but that's a silly claim,
Yeah.
and but it happens a lot where because there are finite resources, there is finite time in the class with the students. We can't teach everything. So as soon as you looked at my curriculum, and went like looked at all the songs that I taught over the course of the whole year, and you looked at, anyone could look at everything I teach in a class and immediately say, well, why didn't you teach X? Why didn't you teach Y? right? And the same thing could be done about Taylor Swift. So if I or any type of popular music, and so ultimately every educator has to make choices about things to not teach. Okay, so where I run into trouble is where teachers start to judge other teachers for the things that they left out, because ultimately these are all decisions that we have to make for our kids, for our places where we work, what works in the community that we teach in, and there are also conversations that are very important about what role different types of music plays in society. So I had kind of hinted at this before when I said that Taylor Swift doesn't need my help, right? But there are other types of music that really does need my help, and that's not the fault of the music. That's the thing is like because earlier you said that I worry if that's the case. If certain types of music need the help of the schools, then I worry about the programs. I disagree with that because there are certain. It goes back to the art museum thing. There are just certain types of art making that are not commercially viable. And so, if they're not offered in academic settings, then people wouldn't know enough stuff about the existence of them to make them continue to be viable. And here would be a corollary, or maybe an example. If I were to if I were to go to a place in the world, and there are many places in the world that don't offer public school funded ensemble classes, right? Almost, in fact, the U.S. is kind of unique in that sense that we even offer band, choir, and orchestra as like during
And a
the
lot of
school
them,
day.
yeah.
Yeah, band, choir, orchestra during the school day, taxpayer funded, at least a portion of it, where kids from wide swaths of the community can access these programs. In a lot of places, that's the evidence for what my concern is that if you look at the way band, choir, and orchestra operate in some of those places in the world, they end up becoming very, very niche community organizations that are only accessible to a very small percentage of the community, and oftentimes they are accessible only to the people who can afford to have their kids pay the tuition for whatever community organization runs the quality choir or the quality band or orchestra.
Well, and,
So
and
in the,
let's not overlook that there are a lot of communities in America where the school programs are like that. That it's very difficult to afford to
yes,
be part, especially instrumental music making with the price of instruments. Yeah.
agreed. I'm just trying to make the distinction between the U.S. in general. There, I, and there could be an empirical disagreement here, and you're welcome to point that out. I'm pretty confident that that there are more public school programs per capita in the U.S. than in most countries in the world, because a lot of times if you're going to do ensemble music, it's something you have to do outside of the school day. In a lot of countries, in most countries, and so there is a little bit of this conversation that I think might be, running the risk of being American centric, but we're both Americans, and so that's hard for us to avoid. But that's just a distinction I think is important in this conversation. Your turn. Thoughts?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was a lot. So
Yeah.
first of all, let me just say again that I think that classical music is really important. I think
Yep.
it's valuable. I think it should be taught in schools.
Yep. I hear you.
Um, I don't think that I don't think that it's wholly sufficient to reach all the kids. I think that
Agreed.
we need to be using a lot of strategies, right?
Yep.
And
Agreed.
I don't think any of these things are the enemy of one another. So let me do all of those things. I don't think there's again any proof of that. And I do agree, people are going to have to make decisions about what they do. And a lot of it comes from who we're also trying to reach and which kids we're trying to reach. The interesting thing about thinking about our musical ensembles in schools acting almost as though a musical museum is interesting to me. Like that. That's a very different goal than lifelong musicianship, right?
Yeah.
Like the perpetuation, and again, this is where people worry about the colonization issue and all these things. Is that we are going to elevate certain composers over others. There are amazing composers that are left out of the conversation historically. and in our classrooms and all these things. And I think all those things are worth talking about and debating, which again is a reason why I think it's really important to offer, a fairly eclectic curriculum in schools when possible,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
That's where I think having a concert band program, a choir program, an orchestra, as many programs as you can have, especially when they overlap into different demographics, is really good.
Yep.
Like all those things, I think we probably agree on. I think we get in our own way. I'll give you a great example. At the small school that I was at, and I'm ashamed to admit this, especially on a choir podcast, but there was talk about starting a choir, and I took it and I got all the data on every successful band program within our classification in my state and every choir program. And I couldn't find anyone that had traditional success at our size of school with both programs and both programs succeeding, right? Like
Mm.
I was completely terrified about what that would look like. And also my administrator had no idea what a choir program looked like. Like we had no choir facilities, he wasn't sure, if there would be a teacher for it, like all these things. There were all these problems that were built in.
Hmm.
Now, if that same conversation happened, I'd be like, let's go. Like, let me help you start the choir program. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I guess I think there would have been more kids studying music, and so that's what I want. There were kids there whose needs weren't being met. We only had a marching band program. You had to be in the marching band to be in music at the school. Well, that's every Monday, every Friday, and most weekends in the entire fall. If you have to work a job or take care of your siblings, you can't participate in that program, right?
Yeah.
We could have created other programs that met other kids. That's one of the things about my pop music program. It's really flexible. I have students that study an instrument and don't perform. You know, I have a lot that perform and I encourage performance heavily. But if a kid wants to study and they're going to come in and make music every day and they're terrified of performing, I can encourage them. This is my grandmother. My grandmother, she passed away last year. She was 93 years old. And we had a conversation about how she started playing piano at 5. And the recital came up and she begged her parents to quit because she was so nervous. And she'd regretted it for 87 years
Yeah.
that she had done it. Had her teacher been like, listen, I want you to perform, I want to encourage you, but not until you're ready. Would that my grandmother have played piano her whole life? Maybe, you know. I can provide incredible flexibility. So, when we have every school is different. Every school is very different. Every school has different schedules to figure out and different gaps that they want to fill. What I'm advocating for is that however we're doing everything, be it choir, band, orchestra, any music education, however we're doing it, it's not the best way. There's no way that we're doing things the best way that we could. Like we're not at the end of the timeline. Like hopefully we're going to keep getting better at all of this. And we
Absolutely.
should be open and flexible for all of these things to be brought into the curriculum. One of the things on that post that kept catching people off is they talk about rap and hip hop, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because while you were saying we're talking about protecting certain classical music traditions and things, and I know a lot of music educators that the phrase rap is crap comes up in their teaching every single year, like lots of people. And I tell you, there are a bunch of kids that live for that type of music. And if you start a conversation with a kid by saying the music you love, I don't love, I hate it, I don't think it's even music, then I challenge you to convince them that the music you care about is actually important. you
Oh,
know
totally
um
agree.
and
Totally
and
agree.
so that my post is really about those things because they hang in there, like all those things hang in there. I love the Holst suites for band, right? Like I love it, and there's kids that absolutely love that. But if that's the only thing that kids thought music could be, I would leave a bunch of kids out. And so that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I'm talking about an openness to considering the variety of ways that we could be teaching music, and not to just assume that certain traditions, you know, are the only ones that are important.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I think that's in a lot of ways we're on the same page. I will um, kind of go back to one other. I think maybe one point of slight divergence is the lifelong music maker's goal. And
Yeah.
this maybe it can be our final little point here because I've already taken an hour from your day. But I struggle with that one too. You said earlier that that confounds you when I talked about having a goal of being lifelong music appreciators, and so
Right.
I'm gonna kind of wrap this up by defending that, and I'll give you the final word. My son plays competitive baseball. He's 12 years old. I have absolutely no expectations that he is going to be a lifelong baseball player, but he will probably be a lifelong baseball fan, and that's okay. And if he were to grow up and stop at some point, stop playing baseball, I would not look back at the 10 to 15 years he played it as a youth and think of that somehow one of his coaches failed him, or one of his or that time was wasted in any way. And I worry sometimes that if our focus is on whether or not the student continues to play or sing forever, then we might feed into a narrative about music education that's already kind of pervasive, which is that, well, my kid's not going to be a professional musician someday, so why do they need lessons? Or my kid's not going to play in college, or they're not going to sing in college, so why would I put them in the choir or the band at the school? We have a double standard in our culture already about how sports and music get approached for kids, I'm personally fine as an educator with the idea that a kid might spend 7 or 8 years doing choir, and some percentage of them will decide that they loved choir for the 7 or 8 years that they were in it, and it just didn't fit into their life anymore, and that doesn't make me a failure. They continue to love and appreciate it, but their life just takes them to other interests and other priorities, and that 7 or 8 years they did it was still very impactful for them, and it was still very life altering in a good way for them. They just didn't choose to keep singing anymore.
Yeah. Well, I by saying I think the more ambitious goal is lifelong musicianship, I'm not saying that if that's not attained, that it wasn't worth doing.
Right.
I'm not saying that. I do say, and the sports metaphor. I hate sports metaphors in music. Like they're so hard. Like a lot of the reason he's not going to play baseball when he's older is because his body's going to hurt and he's not gonna want to go out in the heat and play baseball, right? You
Mm-hmm.
know, but people who sing, you know, lifelong musicianship might be singing lullabies to their children. It might be doing karaoke night once a week. It might be just singing when you get up in the morning or in the shower. And I think that that's a good outcome. Like, I think
Sure,
that's a
I do too.
positive outcome. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
arguing for lifelong professional musicians. I actually think I mean, if we thought we were, if you look at the models, a lot of time it looks like we're trying to create professional musicians. Like that kind of seems to be the focus. You know, all of our processes in the band world and orchestra world are like based around symphony auditions, which there's like no symphony jobs for people. You know, like we seem like we're trying to do that. Like I think an alien looking at how many, if not most, systems are run would say we're trying to produce professional musicians. And I think that's not a great goal. I think that's going to happen when we provide quality programs. There will be plenty of people that will want to become professional musicians. And there may be, in some ways, more opportunities for that than ever before. It's just not concentrated in professional choirs and orchestras. It's spread out in these little puddles of opportunity everywhere.
Yeah.
But, I do want them to see music as something that they can continue. I want it to be something that they know how to continue. And a lot of our programs are not built around actually giving kids those skills. And it can be, like it can be. We already talked about that earlier, that's one of your main goals is that they can learn how to operate outside of here. For band students, that means teaching them how to like write an arrangement of a song. Like if they know how to read music and count rhythms, they can write their own arrangements. They can get together with anyone that plays. It might be being able to improvise and play by ear so that you can casually make music with friends. You know, I think there used to be a lot more of that in the world. I don't know if I have data to support that. And part of that was that there were just less things to do. But a lot of people just really like casually making music. And a lot of people, I think, would do that, but they never learn how. And so for me, when I say lifelong musicianship, I mean that they see themselves as being a musical being, of being able to say and express themselves meaningfully through music and have the skills to do that. And I think you're right. I think there are people that will choose to never make music again. And I think the data on that is that it's almost all of them
Right.
that come through our
Correct.
school program, which I think is the capitulation to, well, at least they appreciate music, and in my sense, which I think is unfair, but that's the way it feels to me. Is we see this goal of lifelong musicianship as not really being attainable for most people, and I actually think it is. The problem I see is that the people that I see that are lifelong musicians, they're doing music that we don't always invite into our schools. And so I know a lot of people that play casually in a band that, boy, I wish they had done that in school and also gotten a lot of the theory around it so that they were more versatile, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would have been really cool for them. And the kids that were in jazz band, those are the people I see that are still playing in the community. A lot of the concert band kids don't play anymore because they're not getting together with 80 of their friends. But everyone else learned how to play by ear and improvise. And you see what I'm saying? Like
Oh
there's
yeah,
certain
totally.
musicianship skills that really foster lifelong musicianship. And at the core of most of our large ensemble music makings, mine included, like it took me a long time to actually incorporate things into my band class built towards lifelong musicianship. We're focused on an ensemble output and not always doing that. So that's my argument there. I think it should be our main goal is that people believe that they are musicians and that they can keep on doing it when they leave. I don't think it's bad if they also just, had a wonderful time and learn from the experience and enjoy music. But, if I had to pick between the two, I would definitely pick that they continue to sing or to play in some capacity just for their own therapeutic enjoyment, if nothing else.
Hmm. Well, definitely on that we can agree. So that's awesome. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun. I could keep nerding on about this all afternoon, but I really appreciate the time you spent with us, and I think people are going to find this very intriguing. So thank you.
Well, I sure hope so. And just to end the debate, I love Beethoven. I love Taylor Swift. I think
Yep,
there's room for all of us. All of us, all the kids, there's room. We just have to want it.
that's awesome. Thank you, Stephen. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you're still here, that means you are one of the true choralosophers that likes to think about the long-form content and the context for conversations like this. So thank you for being here. Don't forget to help the show in whatever ways that you can to make sure that this show can continue. One of the best ways you can do that is at Patreon, patreon.com/Choralosophy. Of course, use the Choralosophy discount code at graphitepublishing.com, endeavormusicpublishing.com, sitereadingfactory.com, mymusicfolders.com, and for Voce Vista analyzing software, you can get that link at choralosophy.com/voce-vista. Thanks, everybody, and don't forget to like, share, and as my kids keep telling me, I need to be telling you to smash that subscribe button and smash the like button. Apparently, that's something that kids like to say on YouTube. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.